To me, it falls the job of telling you about Dad as a family man rather than as a scholar. And I think I'll just head in. This is a picture that I took of him, I think 3 or 4 years ago, but it says a lot about him. It's his smile, his interest beyond just Chinese. He was interested in just about anything that he could lay his hands on of an academic nature. And here he's reading about the Song of the Dodo. It's a story about evolution, and he's very intrigued by the process of life. Dad was born 1922 to a couple of young school teachers. This is Ruth Elizabeth, his mother, and William George Edwin, his father. They, in turn, were children of others. Here is one of the very few pictures I have of my great-grandparent, my great-grandpa Pulleyblank, who was a stonemason. And he himself was the son of a bricklayer. And he understood the value of education, and he conveyed that understanding to his own children, the school teachers, and he basically set in motion the process which brings me here today. Here is another rather significant childhood picture of Dad's. Dad, on the left, needed glasses. He couldn't catch a ball, and that meant that he couldn't compete in those other boyhood games that children were involved in those days. And so he, being a competitive sort of person, competed in other areas. And he became an outstanding scholar at a very young age. And one of the stories we have from that period is that his younger brother, Bob, on the right, surprised his parents by reading street signs at age 4 as they drove by in their car. And it transpired that without their knowledge, my father had taken his young brother aside and taught him to read. He felt that education was important even in that period of his life. And here is another picture of the two young men together. In this case, Dad is the winner of the competition. He managed to catch the most fish, but later on, Bob clearly evened the score. And Bob went on and later became a high school principal, and so he achieved also very important contributions in the education field. And still later, a third child was born to the family, Grace, and she later, many years later, became a minister in the United Church. So she is still with us. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be here, and she just sends her regret. There's another picture as they became teenagers. I don't know who the man on the left is. I think he's a cousin, but this really summarizes a big difference in the personality of Dad and Bob. Bob was always the showman, Dad the scholar. Bob, of course, whoops, that's not the picture I meant it to be. Bob became a musician somewhat. Dad never developed that aspect of his personality, but he really enjoyed good music, and some of what you heard today was music that he had from his collection. The greater family constellation. This is my great-grandfather on my mother's, on Dad's mother's side, with 4 of his 6 daughters, and Ruth, of course, is the one here. That's Dad's mother, and Dad and Bob in the front row, along with Grace, and a couple of the other young cousins. These were strong-minded women. I remember going as a graduate student, and I was pretty full of myself because I thought I was pretty good at those in that era, to visit my grandmother in Calgary, and she and her older sister Susie were going to entertain me by treating me to a Scrabble game. Scrabble has come up already. And I thought, well, you know, a couple of old ladies, I'll humor them. And they proceeded to whoop me in no uncertain terms. So I think that there was a great deal of ability in languages in all parts of the family. This picture is from a family trip to eastern Canada. Dad was growing up in Calgary, but they connected with other people in the family. And in particular, Ruth, Dad's mother, had a cousin who she much enjoyed and loved. And the two of them met together, and along with the cousin, there was the cousin's daughter, Winona, who eventually became Dad's wife, the first wife. And you can, Dad, at that point, was getting through university, and this is, I think, his graduation picture. 1942, the war was on. Dad, during his undergraduate years, was not quite sure that he wanted to be a linguist. He, in fact, studied classics and graduated in classics. But it was a period when he wasn't quite sure that even that was going to be his field. He, at one point, thought he might become a physicist. And he was sufficiently able in that field to be a student a mentor to other students in physics and mathematics while he was an undergraduate. So he was a very gifted scholar in more than one area. And one of the things that happened to him just as he graduated was that one of his professors approached him and asked him if he would be interested in doing secret war work. And this really set the stage for his later career in a way that nobody would have expected. Because this secret war work involved travel to Britain, where he became part of the group at Bletchley, who solved basically the problem of cracking the codes of the Axis powers.
How did he get to Bletchley?
Yeah, we got there. He went by ship.
No, but I mean, how did he get inside?
How did he get? He was asked whether he would be part of that community.
As a young Canadian?
As a young Canadian. They were very much anxious to get anybody who had both ability in languages and mathematics. And that was, the word went out among scholars to recruit young people who had that ability. And he was appointed.
He'd already graduated?
He had just graduated with a degree in classics.
In Calgary?
In Calgary. No, in Edmonton. In Edmonton.
Edmonton.
Yeah, that was the University of Alberta at that time. Yeah. But anyway, at that point, one of the things that I remember being as a child was I didn't know any of this, of course. It was still very secret even then. Dad had been forced to sign the Official Secrets Act, which meant that if he ever spoke anything about what he'd been doing during the war, he could have been put in jail. So it was all a big secret. And one of the things about British school children in that era was that everybody talked about what their dad did during the war, and I couldn't, because I didn't know what it was. And it was a bit of a problem to me. But
what did you do in the war?
Right. But anyway, while he was at Bletchley, he participated in that other secret war, which was the Far Eastern War. He learned Japanese, and that was basically his introduction to Asian languages, and where he began his scientific and his academic interests in Asian languages. This is Bletchley today. It's pretty run down. It's slowly being turned into a museum. It was a very sort of primitive environment. I think that everything was done to make it unobtrusive, not likely to get targeted by the Luftwaffe. Those are the bicycle sheds. That's all they had to use for transport in that period. And it was really a very sort of different environment that I don't think we can really understand in this era. But coming back to Canada in the immediately post-war era, he, of course, was at a point in life when he had other thoughts than just being a scholar. And this is him with his soon-to-be bride, Winona, in the woods. And of course, they are being properly chaperoned by mother's grandmother at that point, no, mother's mother at that point. The wedding followed, and you can see the very pleased look on his face. He clearly thought he'd made a prize, and I think he had. And shortly thereafter, this is another aside. He was, at that point, he went back to England and did his graduate work in Chinese at in the London School of Oriental Studies. And this is a group of young scholars who got together at that point and met regularly over a period of decades almost. And most of our summer vacations in the years following were in some way associated with meetings of this group of people. I'm afraid I can't name anybody but my father, who's on the right, on the left, but we would go off to different places for a meeting, and we, the family, would camp in some campground nearby, and he would go off to his meeting, and then we would do a little tour of the environment thereafter. Here am I, 1948. That's the beginning of my story, and he's really enjoying his family at that point and thereafter. Here is something else that happened soon after. He was appointed professor of Chinese at the University of Cambridge at the extraordinarily young age of 29. And I don't fully understand how he got this very senior appointment as such a young man, but I believe that what happened was that another position became vacant at the same time, and there were very few candidates for either position. And the consequence of not filling the position would be that it would simply disappear. And so the University of Cambridge were put in the position of having to fill the position or lose it. And because of that, my father managed to secure the appointment. I don't think that would happen today, but this was the immediate post-war period, and there were very few people who had the sort of requisite training to take on.
When was this?
This was 1953.
1961?
1953.
1953.
1953. Yeah. So I think that if this hadn't happened, Dad would have ended up in the diplomatic service in some obscure position, and his academic career would probably have been cut off at that point. But this was one of those accidents of life which really changed the way we lived. And that's me in the foreground. I was visited Cambridge last summer. Dad became a fellow of Downing College, which is the building in the background. My family was growing. My two sisters and myself are here, and mother and father, and also my grandmother, who visited us while we were there in Cambridge. In the background is the house that my parents built. It's still there. It was actually a bit of an architectural marvel for its era. It had an open concept ground floor, which was totally unknown in British architecture. And it was really something of an adventure that they had putting this place together. Time goes on, and Dad decided that really he would like to move back to Canada. UBC advertised the position of assistant professor. And Dad, on a whim, thought he might apply. But he wasn't going to go there as an assistant professor. And I think when the word got through that he was actually interested in being moved, that's when Bill Holland went to the dean and managed to have the position upgraded to that of a full professor. And that's basically what brought us back to Canada. Time goes on. This was the year I graduated from UBC. I came here as an undergraduate. We went back to Europe for a family vacation, and we traveled together in this van that we rented. It was really a wonderful event, and it was actually the last time the family managed to travel together in a camping trip. Later on, I went to the University of Alberta as a graduate student, and while I was there, I invited Dad to go hiking with me, and I took him on something of a big adventure up to Fryatt Hut in the High Rockies. This is just part of the beginning part of the trip. You can see by the short sleeves that things were warm and pleasant. But then the weather turned, and it got cold, and we got lost. And we ended up camping out, and he took it in. It was just part of the life that we shared at that time. That was where we thought we might spend the night, the Tova Glacier. We did actually manage to find the hut eventually, but that was not at that particular moment. Time goes on further. I graduate and come to the University of Toronto and meet my young wife, and this is at our wedding. There was a sad side to this, though. At that time, my mother was very ill, and so she is there and managed to be present at our wedding, but she died very shortly thereafter. The family expands. We have our daughter and my sisters together at Toronto. And Dad really enjoyed his grandchildren, and he's interacting with our oldest daughter, Amber, and my son, who can't be here today, and now also with our third child, Corin, who is the youngest daughter, who is here today. And you can see by his interest and her interest that they are connecting right there. This picture is of the three siblings, Dad and his brother Bob and sister Grace. I think it was actually the last time they were all together. It was at Bob's 50th wedding anniversary held in Nanaimo. I'm not exactly sure of the year, but it is one of those events that we treasure. And this photograph is one of those photographs. And another visit with the family, and Doug's family is here, also in Nanaimo, and his mother and father also. And Robin, Doug's sister, and her husband and children as well. Another family trip, this one to my in-laws' place in New Hampshire, and we all met together on Dad's 75th birthday, and together we climbed Mount Sunapee. And this is a little bit less of a arduous trip than the trip up to Fryatt Hut, but he did it with distinction, and this is a t-shirt that my daughters put together for him on his return from that adventure. And finally, from my talk, at the age of 80 years old, Dad remarried to Yihung, who is here today, and from here, Yihung will carry forward the story of the last decade.